So before I begin, let me reintroduce you to the core features of Oracle. Here at Oracle, we have live classes to elevate your learning experience. And apart from that, we also provide you with recorded lectures so that you can assess them according to your convenience, anytime, anywhere, as per your wish. And apart from that, we also give notes that are based on the latest syllabus. And then we also provide you with MCQ so that you can assess your knowledge. Then a very unique feature of Oracle is that we provide you with personalized counseling sessions. So apart from the academic support, if you want some extra guidance and support pertaining to areas other than academics, you can anytime book a slot with us for that extra guidance and support from our end. Then we have three different subscription plans at Oracle. The basic plan, which comes for 15,000 and will last for 3 months, followed by the standard plan, which is for 6 months and will cost you 30,000. And then we have the annual plan, that is the mentorship plan, which comes at 50,000. This mentorship plan, it also has live doubt clarification sessions, then one-to-one personalized guidance, and notes will also be provided in mentorship plan. Then apart from this, you can get additional 20% discount if you use my promo code as displayed on the screen. Then briefly introducing you to this series, that is the internal exam marathon. So this series has been specifically created to target your university exam so that you can benefit from this series. We plan to touch at least the entire syllabus rapidly in a span of 2 to 3 months so that you are prepared, completely prepared for your exams. So there will be rapid revision of all important questions and frequently asked topics. Then volatile quick facts will also be covered in this. Apart from that, MCQs will be taken so that we can assure you top-notch grades in your exams. Okay. So beginning with enzymes. So firstly, let's define enzymes. That what are enzymes? Okay. So enzymes are their protein catalysts. So now you get to know about two characteristics of enzymes. Firstly, that they are proteinaceous in nature. They are proteins. That is one thing about enzymes. Then they are catalysts. Okay. So I'm sure all of you must be knowing what a catalyst. Catalysts are used in reactions to facilitate or speed up the reactions. Okay. But they themselves are not consumed during the reactions. Okay. They remain unchanged. So your enzymes, they are protein catalysts that increase the rate of reaction without being changed in the overall process. Okay, so this is a very simple definition of enzymes, that they are involved in catalyzing reactions. Okay, and they are proteinaceous in nature. Now this word enzyme, it was given by Frederick Kuhne. Okay, now what are substrates? Substrates are those substances on which the enzyme acts, and products are the substances which are produced by the enzyme action. So that is substrate and product. I'm sure you know it already. Okay, so with the help of a diagram, it will become more clear. See, this is your enzyme shown in green. This enzyme, it has active sites. Okay, that is where your substrate is going to come and bind. So those sites are known as active sites. So every enzyme has an active site. To that active site, what is binding? Your substrate, as shown here in yellow. That substrate is binding. Okay. And then ultimately what is happening by the end of the reaction? You are getting your products. You see the substrate was yellow, but the products that are formed are purple and blue. And your enzyme, but you see on the other hand, it remains unchanged. Okay, so the enzyme remains unchanged at the end of the reaction. Now, a very simple classification of enzymes. Your enzymes can be classified into as simple enzymes and complex enzymes. So simple enzymes are the ones which have only protein part. Okay. So what is a simple enzyme? It is only having a protein part. But there are also complex enzymes as well. Now, what are complex enzymes? They have a protein as well as a non-protein part to themselves. Okay. So the protein part, which is the apoenzyme, it is inactive unless and until a non-protein part comes and binds to it and makes it active. Okay, so that is a complex enzyme for you, having a protein part and having a non-protein part. Now, talking about complex enzyme in details, the complex enzyme, as I said, they have a protein part, which is known as apoenzyme. So the apoenzyme, it is going to be inactive. Now, when non-protein part, which is known as cofactor or coenzyme, comes and bind to it, the apoenzyme or the protein part, it becomes active. Okay. So, firstly, we spoke about what are enzymes. We defined enzymes. Then we said that enzymes can either be simple, having. Firstly, we said in our definition that they are proteins. Okay, that was first thing. But then on classifying them, we said that there are simple enzymes which only have protein. But apart from that, we have complex enzyme as well, which have protein and non-protein part to it. Okay. Now, complex enzymes, we are going to study them in detail. So, the protein part of complex enzyme, which is known as apoenzyme, and the non-protein part, which is known as cofactor or coenzyme. So, talking about what are cofactors and coenzymes. So, your cofactor, if the non-protein moiety is a metal such as zinc or iron, then it is known as cofactor. So, if the non-protein part is a metal, it is known as cofactor. And coenzymes, you have heard this term a lot number of times, especially when we were talking about vitamins. Okay, so it's all fresh in your mind already. So what are coenzymes? If the non-protein part is a small organic molecule, okay, like the active forms of vitamins. So coenzymes are commonly derived from vitamins. See, it says here. We have already studied so many vitamin coenzymes that were derived from vitamins, that is your NAD, FMN, FAD, and your vitamin K was also acting as a coenzyme. So NAD contains niacin, FAD contains riboflavin. We've already discussed. We also discussed flavoproteins, and we've discussed all of that in detail. Okay, so cofactors, they are that non-protein part which are metals, and coenzymes, they are that non-protein part which are small organic molecules. Okay. Now your coenzymes, they can either be co-substrates or prosthetic group. Okay, don't get confused between the various terms. Okay. So I'm going really slow. What a co-substrate? Now coenzymes that only transiently, that is for a very small time, associate with the enzyme. They dissociate from the enzyme in an altered state. That is why they are getting altered. So they are therefore known as co-substrates. Okay. So now they are saying what are co-substrate? Co-substrate are those coenzymes that only for a short period of time they associate with the enzyme, and then this disassociate from the enzyme in a changed manner or in an altered state. Okay, so those are known as co-substrates. So the example can be NAD. Okay, NAD in your glycolysis. Okay, now prosthetic group. If the coenzyme is permanently associated with the enzyme and returns to its original form, it is known as prosthetic group. Like your FMN. Okay, we spoke about riboflavins, if you remember, flavoproteins, flavoenzymes, if you remember when we were doing riboflavin vitamin, that is just yesterday only. So I told you they are tightly, the FMN and FAD, they are found tightly bound to enzymes that are involved in oxidation and reduction of substrates. Okay, so when your coenzyme is permanently and tightly associated with the enzyme, it is known as prosthetic group. And when it is only associated with the enzyme transiently, it is known as co-substrate. Okay. Now, what is holoenzyme? Your apoenzyme, that was the protein part. Along with its non-protein part together is known as holoenzyme, and this holoenzyme is active. Okay. So we have learned different new terms. I hope it's clear. Firstly, the definition of enzymes. Then what are simple and complex enzymes? Then in complex enzymes, you have various terms. What is apoenzyme? That is the protein part of the complex enzyme. Then you have two new terms, that is cofactor and coenzyme. So cofactor is the non-protein moiety, which is metal. Then your coenzyme is the non-protein part, is a small organic molecule, that is your coenzyme. Then you have co-substrate and prosthetic groups, that is if the coenzyme is transiently associated with the enzyme, it is co-substrate. And if the prosthetic group is that where the coenzyme is permanently associated with the enzyme, that becomes your prosthetic group like FMN or FAT. Okay, so that was about generally speaking about enzymes. So we covered general enzymology. Now moving on to the mechanism of enzyme action. So mechanism of enzyme action, it can be explained by the following theories, that is lowering of activation energy. That is one theory, very important. Actually, the whole of mechanism of enzyme action is important. Okay, so you can get asked about any of these in short notes, or in a long question you can be asked about explain the various theories that talk about mechanism of enzyme action. Okay, so you need to know all of them. Michaelis-Menten theory, Fischer-Tempel theory, and Buchholz-infused fit theory. Now, talking about lowering of activation energy. Okay, so there is this particular transition state where the reacting substance has to reach to be converted into the product. So it is something like this. Okay, so this is your transition state. Okay, so your substrates are here. Okay, they have suppose this is the basal energy of the substrate at this level here. Okay, now these substrates, they have to reach a particular energy, that is the transition state as shown here, okay, which is at a higher energy level, okay. So there is a particular transition state where the reacting substance, that is your substrate, has to reach to be converted into product. So this substrate, it has to reach this transition state in order to be converted into product, okay. Now, the amount of energy that is required for a reacting substance to reach that transition state is called as activation energy. So this is the basal energy of your substrate, and this is the transition state. Okay, so this is the energy of the transition state. Now it says that the amount of energy that is needed by the substrate to reach that transition state, that is this energy. This energy is known as the activation energy. Okay, so in case of uncatalyzed reaction, reaching the transition state is very difficult. So enzymes lower the transition state so that reacting substance can easily reach the transition state and get converted into products. So now this transition state is here. So this is an uncatalyzed reaction. But when catalysts or enzymes are used, the transition state, it will be lowered. It might be somewhere here. Okay. So now what will happen? Now this is the energy that the substrate has to reach. Okay. So this earlier, this was the activation energy, but now this is the activation energy. So you see the enzymes they have lowered the activation energy, thus aiding the conversion of substrate into product. So free energy, but very important thing, that is the free energy remains same in both catalyzed and uncatalyzed reaction, and this is often asked in MCQs. Okay, this diagram that I've roughly drawn here, I'll explain this to you again. Okay, see, with the help of this diagram you can see. So this is the initial state. Okay, this is the initial state of the reactants, that is your substrate, are here at this level. This is the energy level of the substrates. Now what happens? These substrate, they have to reach a particular transition state. Now this is the transition state, as you can see here. This is the transition state. So your substrate, they have to reach this transition state. Okay, so this energy gap that is there, this is known as the activation energy. Okay, but what happens when you are using catalyst? You can see this transition state, this new transition state is here now. This is the new transition state. Now this is the activation energy. So you see the activation energy has been lowered with the help of the use of the catalysts. This is where your products are being formed. This is the final state of the products. And it also says that the free energy remains same. As you can also see in the graph, free energy is unchanged in both catalyzed and uncatalyzed reactions. So you see the free energy of the reaction is same. It is not changing. Either you use an enzyme or you do not use an enzyme. What is changing? There is lowering of activation energy. So the enzymes, they lower the activation energy. And what is the activation energy? It is the amount of energy that is needed by the reactants to attain that transition state. Okay. So that activation energy is lowered when you use enzymes. So this is one of the theories of mechanism, enzyme actions. Now the other is Michaelis-Menten theory. It says that the enzyme combines with the substrate to form enzyme-substrate complex, which immediately breaks down to the enzyme and the product. So you can see here in this diagram, you have your enzyme shown here in yellow, and then you have the substrate in red and blue. Okay, now what happens? The substrate, they bind to the active side of the enzyme to form an enzyme substrate complex. Now what happens? The enzyme is going to act and your enzyme's product complex is formed. You see, this was the action of the enzyme. Now the substrate has changed into products, you can see, and then ultimately the products are released and your enzyme remains unchanged. So this is Michaelis-Menten theory. It's where it says that an enzyme substrate complex is formed. Okay. Now talking about Fisher's template theory. So the active side of the enzyme is complementary to the substrate. Now very important, it is saying that the active side, for example, if this is your enzyme, okay, so your substrate can be something like this. Okay, so it says the active side, this is the active side. The active side is complementary to the substrate. This is your substrate. And as you can see, if this is your active side, your substrate cannot look something like this. No, this is not supported by this theory because this is not complementary, okay? Or your substrate cannot be something like this, okay? If your active side looks like this, then your substrate is something like this, okay? So your substrate is always complementary to the active side, okay? You see, this is the active side, this is the substrate. This is the active side, this is the substrate, okay? So it says this Fisher's template theory, it says that the active side of the enzyme, the active side is complementary to the substrate. Okay. Now, thus enzyme and substrate fit each other. So for every enzyme, there is a substrate similar to lock and key. So just like for a particular lock, you have a particular key. You cannot open one lock with the key of some other lock. Okay. So for one lock, there is one specific key. In a similar manner, for every enzyme, there is a specific substrate. Okay, because that enzyme, it is going to have an active site which is complementary to the substrate. Okay. Now, what is the failure of this story? This theory failed to explain the flexibility shown by the enzymes. Okay, so the dynamic nature of enzyme action cannot be explained by this theory because this theory is trying to indicate that enzymes are rigid. which is not true. Okay, so the flexibility that is shown by the enzymes was not being explained by this Fisher template theory. See, with the help of the diagram, it will become more clear. So you have this enzyme, and you see the active side of this enzyme is exactly complementary to the substrate. Okay, just like a lock and a key. So the substrate is going to correctly fix on the enzyme and form an enzyme substrate complex. You see here? But if the substrate is not complementary to the active site, the enzyme cannot fit the substrate. Not talking about Koshland's induced fit theory. So initially, the substrate binds to a specific part of the enzyme. This leads to substrate-induced conformational changes in the active site of the enzyme to fit the substrate into it. Now, this theory is trying to say that the active site of the enzyme is not complementary to the substrate. Rather, what is happening? First, your substrate is going to bind to some specific part of the enzyme, and then conformational changes as your the substrate approaches the enzyme. What is happening? This conformational changes are going to take place in the active site of the enzyme in order to accommodate that substrate in the active site. Okay, just like a pair of gloves takes the shape of the hands of whosoever wears it. This theory can also explain the dynamic changes associated with the enzyme action. So your previous theory here, Fisher's template theory, it was based on lock and key model. Okay, so if you remember Fisher's theory, just remember lock and key. So you will know, just like for every lock, you have a specific key. That means your active site is complementary to the substrate. So for every enzyme, there is a specific substrate. Okay, that was Fisher's template theory. Whereas in Koshland's induced fit theory, what is happening? You have to remember a pair of gloves. So you have to remember that it is similar to a pair of gloves. Just like a pair of gloves, they're lying around, they have a different shape. But the moment someone tries to wear it, okay, so they're going to take the shape of the hand of whosoever is going to wear it. If I'm going to wear it and I have smaller hands, they'll take my shape. Somebody else with larger hands going to wear them, so they're going to stretch a little and take their shape. So this is exactly what is happening with enzymes and substrate as well. So initially, your active site is not complementary to the substrate. But due to conformational changes taking place in the active site, you can see substrate induced. And who is inducing these conformational changes? The substrate itself is going to induce conformational changes in the active site of the enzyme. Okay, so conformational changes will take place in the active site of the enzyme, and those conformational changes will be such that your substrate can be accommodated or fitted into the active site. This theory is also, since this theory, conformational changes are taking place, so this theory is also able to explain the flexibility or the dynamic changes associated with enzyme action. So you see this theory has an upper hand compared to the previous one. Now let's see this through the help of a diagram. You see this is your substrate, and you see the active site has shallow grooves. The grooves are not very deep. But you see here, the substrate, it is very deep like this. Whereas your active site has a very shallow groove. Okay, it is not like this. So it is not complementary. Now what is happening? The substrate alignment is not correct. A fixing of the substrate. It comes and binds to the enzyme. Because of this binding to a specific site of the enzyme, what is happening? Structural changes or conformational changes are going to take place in the active site. Now the substrate correctly fits into active site. You see the substrate has correctly accommodated itself, fitted into the active site. Now substrate is cleaved into products as you can see here, and the enzyme remains unchanged. Okay, this is Koshland's induced fit theory. The name itself is indicated. So we are done with mechanism of enzyme action. This is an important topic. So we had 4 different theories. Firstly, it was lowering of activation energy. Secondly, Michaelis-Menten theory. Then Fisher's template theory and Koshland's induced fit. So here, for remembering purposes, you remember gloves. You remember lock and key. And you remember enzyme substrate complex being formed. And in this, your activation energy is lowered. And whereas free energy remains unchanged. Okay. So that was about mechanism of enzyme action. Now moving forward to enzyme kinetics or the factors affecting enzyme activity. So what are the factors that are going to affect your enzyme activity? Which is also known as enzyme kinetics. So we're going to talk about that now. So first is talking about enzyme concentration. So reaction velocity is directly proportional to the enzyme concentration. So this is the reaction velocity, that is the rate at which a reaction is taking place, that is known as reaction velocity, and it says that this reaction velocity is directly proportional to the enzyme concentration provided the substrate is constant. Okay, so if you're keeping the substrate constant, that is for a given substrate, if you increase the enzyme, what will happen? The reaction velocity or the rate at which the reaction is going to take place, it is going to increase. And it is, how are they two related? They are directly proportional. Okay. So if something is directly proportional, you get a straight line graph. The graphs are really important. Sometimes what happens, the graphs for kinetics and also the graph for enzyme inhibition, which will be our next topic. So the graphs are really important. Sometimes in MCQs, you can get asked like about uh, which of the following is the graph for competitive inhibition, or which of the following is the graph for non-competitive inhibitions, and you have 4 different graphs in the options and you have to mark the correct one. Okay. So with the help of a graph, if you see, you have this velocity on the y-axis and you have enzyme concentration at the x-axis, and substrate concentration remains constant. So what is happening? As you increase the enzyme concentration, the velocity of the reaction is going to increase. So it's a straight line graph. Moving on to the effect of temperature on enzyme activity. So initially on increasing the temperature, the reaction velocity increases. Okay. So if you increase the temperature, the velocity of the reaction is going to increase, and until and unless it reaches a point of maximum velocity. And that maximum velocity is at optimum temperature, and then there is a drastic fall in velocity which is due to denaturation of enzymes. Okay, so it is going to give a bell-shaped curve. See here, you're increasing the temperature, the velocity is increasing. Ultimately, it reaches this maximum velocity. And this maximum velocity is at the optimum temperature. Okay, optimum temperature. So optimum temperature is that temperature where enzymes have maximum velocity. Okay, so the maximum velocity of the reaction is at optimum temperature. Okay, so you increase the temperature, the velocity of the reaction is increasing until it reaches the maximum velocity, that is at optimum temperature. Then there is a drastic fall. You see, there's a drastic fall in the velocity of the reaction. And why is it so? Because denaturation of enzymes take place at higher temperatures. What is happening? Your enzymes are proteins. So the proteins get denatured. The tertiary structure is lost. Okay. So since the tertiary structure is lost, the activity will be hampered. And this is a bell-shaped curve, unlike the previous one which we studied was a straight line graph. This is a bell-shaped curve. Optimum temperature of most enzymes in a body is between the range of 35 to 40 degrees Celsius. So that is the optimum temperature. Therefore, it is very important when you have high-grade fever, we say that the temperature has to be brought down somehow. If not, denaturing of various enzymes, which is very dangerous, will start to take place. And what is Q10? For every 10-degree rise in temperature, the reaction velocity doubles. So that is known as Q10. So that was about effect of temperature on enzyme activity. So in temperature, you have a bell-shaped curve. There's one thing to remember. So if you remember bell-shaped curve, all the points will automatically fall into place that on increasing the temperature, the reaction velocity is initially going to increase and reach a maximum velocity at optimum temperature, and then there's a drastic fall because of denaturation of the enzymes. Then talking about the pH. So pH and temperature, they have the same effect. pH and the reaction velocity are also associated to a bell-shaped curve. So optimum pH is the pH at which there is maximum velocity, just like optimum temperature. In our body, the optimum pH is between 5 to 9 for most enzymes. Your stomach, it has optimum pH between 2 to 4 because it has an acidic range. So the stomach enzymes, they function in acidic range. The optimum pH is 2 to 4, and intestine, the optimum pH is in alkaline range. So your intestinal enzymes are not going to work in stomach, and the stomach enzymes will not work in intestine. Again, it is a bell-shaped curve, like I said. So on increasing the pH, the enzyme velocity is going to increase unless and until it reaches the maximum velocity, which is at optimum temperature, at optimum pH here. And then it is going to fall. Okay, it is a bell-shaped curve, as you can see. Now, talking about substrate concentration. This substrate concentration gives a hyperbolic graph. So we will see what is a hyperbolic graph. On increasing the enzyme concentration, on keeping the enzyme concentration constant, actually, not increasing. So initially on adding substrate, the reaction velocity increases. So if you keep the enzyme concentration is constant, okay? Now what is happening? You're increasing the substrate. So initially what is happening in the initial phase, on increasing the substrate or adding more substrate to the reaction, what will happen? Your velocity, on you increase the substrate, your velocity is also going to increase. So this will be directly proportional. But later on what happens? It reaches a plateau phase. That is stagnant and becomes stagnant. You keep on increasing the substrate, but the velocity is not going to change. Okay, it is going to remain unchanged. So that is the plateau phase, that there is no effect. And why is this happening? Because you see the enzyme concentration is constant. Okay, so if whatever for a given amount of enzyme, if you increase the substrate, so initially what will happen? More of substrate is going to bind to the active sites of the given concentration of the enzyme. But after a certain point, what will happen? The saturation state is reached. Okay, so all the enzymes, their active sites are already saturated with the substrate. So it does not matter anymore that if you keep on increasing the substrate concentration, the plateau phase has already been reached because there is saturation and the velocity will further not increase. So as there is saturation of the enzyme with the substrate after the initial phase, a plateau phase is reached, and this is known as substrate saturation curve, which is a hyperbolic graph. So in the initial phase, what is happening? They are directly proportional. You increase the substrate concentration, the velocity of the enzyme is going to increase. So it follows a first order kinetics. But in the plateau phase, what is happening? You increase the substrate concentration, no effect is going to take place on the velocity of the reaction. So this is following zero order kinetics. Okay, it will be more clear when you see the graph. This is the hyper, as you see here. This is the initial phase. In the initial phase, what is happening? You increase the substrate concentration and your velocity is increasing. Okay. And then you can see this is the plateau phase being reached. You can see the V max, no matter what the substrate concentration is, you keep on increasing the substrate reaches here, but your Vmax reaction velocity is going to remain unchanged. Okay, so nothing is happening to the maximum velocity. So this is the plateau phase following the zero order kinetics. So the effect of the substrate concentration on enzyme activity, it follows a hyperbolic graph. So in enzyme kinetics, we have taken the effect of enzyme concentration. It gives a straight line graph. If you remember the graphs, it becomes very easy. That is, on increasing the concentration of the enzyme, the velocity is going to increase provided the substrate concentration is constant. And talking about the temperature, it gives a bell-shaped curve. So if you remember the bell, you will know that initially on increasing the temperature, what is going to happen? The velocity of the reaction is going to increase until and unless it reaches the maximum velocity. And after maximum velocity, what is going to happen? That is, at the optimum temperature, there's a drastic fall in the velocity of the reaction. Why so? Because of the denaturing of the enzymes. As your enzymes are proteins, the proteins, they get denatured at very high temperature. So denatured proteins, that is, your enzyme activity is affected. Therefore, the velocity of the reaction is going to decrease. Now, talking about the pH, it has similar effects as the temperature. It gives a bell-shaped curve. There's an optimum pH range. In that optimum pH range, the enzymes are going to function their best. That is, their velocity will be maximum. And as they go, the pH range exceeds beyond the optimum range, the reaction of the velocity is going to decrease. Then talking about substrate concentration, it gives a hyperbolic curve in the initial phase. It follows the first order kinetics. That is, if you increase the substrate concentration, the velocity of the enzyme, the velocity of the reaction is going to increase. Why is it happening? Because, you know, you have a certain particular amount of enzyme. Okay. Now, if you increase the substrate concentration, more and more enzyme is going to be bound to the substrate. But after a certain time, what is happening when saturation phase has been reached, that is, all of the enzyme and the active sites, they're bound with substrate. It doesn't matter anymore that how much substrate you're adding on. The plateau phase has been reached, saturation has been reached, all the enzymes are already bound with the substrate. So there will be no effect on the velocity. So that is the plateau phase, which follows the zero order kinetics. And this is the graph for it here. Okay. Now, very important, Michaelis-Menten constant, known as Km in short. This is a very important topic, very hot topic, frequently asked, even asked in vivas. Okay. So that substrate concentration at which the velocity is half of maximum. So what is Michaelis-Menten constant Km? It is that substrate concentration. It is okay. So for example, I'll explain you. Let's say the maximum velocity of a given reaction is 4. Okay. So this is V max. And this V max is, let's say, for a concentration of 10. Now, at, let's say, 5, for a concentration of 5 mg per dl. Okay, what is happening at this concentration? If the velocity is half of V max, that is, the velocity of the reaction is 2, then we say this is Km. The Km of this reaction is 5. So it is that substrate concentration at which the reaction velocity is half of the maximum velocity. If your maximum velocity was 4, And it was for us, let's say for any concentration, let's say for concentration A, the reaction velocity, the maximum velocity was 4. Okay, now the velocity of the reaction is 2. So whatever at 2, whatever is the concentration of the substrate, that is going to be your Km. Do you get my point? Very simple concept. I'll repeat it. Okay. Yeah. So that substrate concentration at which the velocity of the reaction is half of the maximum velocity, that is known as Michaelis-Menten constant, or Km. Km is constant for a given substrate pair. Okay, so Km is like a signature. It is like a thumb impression. Okay, so it is constant for a particular enzyme substrate pair. Okay, it is not going to change for a given for a particular enzyme substrate pair. It is always constant. Okay. So it is like the signature or thumb impression. Thumb impression or signature. Like the thumb impression or the signature is a constant. It is same for a given person. Okay. Similarly, your Km is constant for a given enzyme substrate pair. Now it tells about the affinity. Now why is Km important? Because it tells about the affinity between a substrate for its enzyme. Okay. So that is its linkage or its association, that how strongly is that particular substrate associated with its enzyme. That affinity can be judged or can be indicated through the Km. How? Higher Km means lower is the affinity of the substrate for the enzyme. Higher Km means you have higher Km, okay? Km is more. And what is Km? Km is substrate concentration at which the velocity of the reaction is half of the maximum velocity. So, for example, if Km is high, that is you are needing a lot of substrate concentration to reach the maximum velocity. That means the affinity is poor. The affinity is low between the substrate and the enzyme. Okay. And if the Km is low, that is if you have a very little, very minute amount of substrate, very little substrate concentration at lower Km, and still you are reaching the half of Vmax. Okay, so the reaction velocity is still Vmax. That means even with a very small amount of substrate concentration, you are able to reach half of Vmax. Therefore, it means that the affinity is very strong. Okay, the bonding, the association between the substrate and the enzyme is very strong. So lower Km means higher affinity. So in these cases, you only remember one thing and the other will fall into place. If you try to remember both of these statements, you are bound to get yourself confused. So if just remember lower Km, that is you are needing very little substrate, and what is happening? You are able to attain half of Vmax in a very little amount of substrate concentration. That means the association between the substrate and the enzyme must be very high. The affinity for each other must be very high. So lower Km means higher affinity and higher Km means lower affinity. Okay. Now Km value helps to find out ideal substrate for every enzyme. So depending upon the Km value, so if some enzyme substrate complex, they are having a higher affinity, so we can say that this is ideal for it. If it having a lower affinity for a certain enzyme, a substrate, given substrate having a lower affinity for a given enzyme, then we can say that this is not its ideal enzyme or ideal substrate for that particular enzyme. So that was about Michaelis-Menten constant. I'll repeat once again that it is that substrate concentration at which the velocity of the reaction is half of the maximum velocity. Here, if you see in this diagram, to be more clear, see, through this diagram, this is Vmax. Here, this is Vmax. And you see, this is half of Vmax. So if you extrapolate this graph, half of Vmax is coming here. So this substrate concentration at which you get half of Vmax, this is known as Km. Okay, and Km is what? This is substrate concentration. And that particular substrate concentration at which the velocity is half of Vmax. Excuse me. Now the last topic for today's class, that is Lineweaver-Burke double reciprocal plot. So for determining Km using substrate saturation curve, it is not very accurate since Vmax is approached Vmax is approached asymptotically. Here, if you see this was the substrate saturation curve. So if you see, if we use this graph for calculating Km, okay? So this is not very useful since you can see this Vmax, this is tending to go to infinity, okay? So you cannot get very accurate values for Km. So that is what it means by that Vmax is approached asymptotically. Instead, a plot of reciprocal of velocity, that is 1 by V, versus a plot of reciprocal of substrate is used, which gives a straight line. And this is known as Lineweaver-Burke double reciprocal plot. Okay, it is much easier to calculate Km using this plot. This plot is also useful in understanding the effect of various inhibitions. So when we study various inhibitions, you will see how this plot comes handy. The mathematical derivation of this plot is not needed, so I'm not taking that up. Here, this is the picture of the plot. You can see reciprocal of Vmax and reciprocal of substrate concentration has been used. You have 1 by V on the y-axis and you have 1 by S on the substrates. 1 by S on the x-axis. Okay, this is your x-axis, this is your y-axis. So therefore, it is known as reciprocal, double reciprocal plot. Because you have two reciprocals being used on the y and the x-axis. And this plot is used to give the Km value. The slope of this plot is Km upon Vmax. You see, if you extend this on the minus x-axis, you're getting 1 by Km. And where it extrapolates or cuts the y, it gives the 1 by Vmax. So that was about Lineweaver-Burke double reciprocal plot. So with this, we come to the end of today's class. If you have any queries, you can ask. For tomorrow's lecture, we will be taking various types of enzyme inhibition. Again, a very important topic. After that, we'll take isoenzymes, that is clinical enzymology. And with that, we come to the end of our enzymes. So if anything to ask, enzymes are very important. Their classification, inhibition, enzyme kinetics, all of these topics are really important. The graphs are also very important, especially for the point of MCQs for your PGs as well. Okay, thank you for watching. See you in the next class.